from India's perspective, this latest clash just reaffirms what we believe of the Chinese, what the Indian establishment believes of the Chinese. And it means, you have to really significantly strengthen your infrastructure in the eastern sector. You have to have adequate military resources across the line of actual control, and you should stay on alert.
You're watching Hindustan Times Insight, and I am with the paper's editor-in-chief, Sukumar Ranganathan. On the agenda today is the clash between the Indian Army and the Chinese PLA on December 9th in the Tawang sector of Arunachal Pradesh. Now, Chinese military's failed land-grabbing bid along the line of actual control in Tawang has once again raised concerns about Beijing's increasing belligerence in the backdrop of the already existing tensions with India in eastern Ladakh. Let me dive straight in, Sukumar. There are some experts who believe that Tawang is a firm message from China that it believes that India is deliberately ignoring the red lines that it has earmarked over its political as well as the military red lines. They see another India-China war on the cards sooner or later. The point is not when, it's if, they say. Would you agree with that viewpoint?
See, I'm not going to get into a discussion on whether there's going to be a war or not, right? I mean, it's one of those things it's a mug's game if you set out to predict whether there's going to be a war or not. I think it makes sense to look at the possible theories which have been suggested so far and which are very logical as to why this has happened. The first one is that it is business as usual. And when I say business as usual, I say this in the context of Arunachal remaining one of those hot button issues between India and China since 1962. The Chinese occupied it in 62, vacated it, but have always laid claim to it, call it South Tibet. India has managed to fortify its presence there. In fact, the eastern sector, our preparations have always been far better than they've been in the western sector, maybe because of the traditional issues that India has had with China. Incursions keep happening, they keep getting pushed back. I am told that in this particular scenario, this was an attempt by the Chinese to gain the high ground in a particular area, and that they were repulsed. And our defense writer tells me that it keeps happening, and they've been successfully pushed back yet again. As to whether it is possible to compare the magnitude of this incursion with magnitudes of previous incursions, I think again, you're delving into the hypothetical. So that's one scenario, right? Then there is a second one that says that this is a message to India, right? Because the fact is, India as with the trigger being the exercises that India conducted with the US at Auli in Uttarakhand. Quite some distance from the LAC, but you know how Beijing sensitivities are, and Beijing didn't make some noise about it. Sees itself as the only rival to the US in this scenario, and doesn't want anyone else cozying up to the US, leave alone India, which is in China's backyard.
And they've actually come and said that it violates the 1993 and the 1996 bilateral agreements.
As an aside, completely ignoring the fact that whatever they did in Galwan
violated everything.
Right? So that's the second theory. Is it possible? Yes, as possible as the first. But there's also a third theory, which I think, equal likelihood, which is that this is a message, yes, but it's also a message which is aimed largely at an internal customer. Because you look at what's happening in China right now, and as we speak, I think there are tens of millions of cases, and soon there will be hundreds of millions of cases, God forbid, of COVID-19 in China, because they finally eased their policies, they've allowed people to get infected. We know their vaccines do not work as efficaciously as other vaccines that have been used. Hopefully, they will not have too many deaths. But from a zero COVID, they've now moved to a policy where they've said, it's pretty much opened up, and the results are there, and you do not want people to focus too much on that. So you give them something else to look at, except that even the hyper-nationalist newspapers there don't seem to be focusing too much on this clash, right? So there are three theories. Now, which one of these is it? You could take any of those. But I think as for people who are sitting here in New Delhi, the policymakers who are sitting in New Delhi, the military planners who are sitting in New Delhi, I don't think they are wasting their time worrying about, and this is the smart thing, they're not wasting their time worrying about what could have prompted China to act, what the trigger could be. I think as far as the Indian establishment is concerned, this just reaffirms the fact that this is a hypersensitive border, that China will continue to build infrastructure, because what seems to have happened in this case is, if you look at how the Chinese operate in the eastern sector, they use these villages, right? So these are villages, temporary villages, which are set up by herdsmen. And the herdsmen from both sides do traverse across the border because there's really no border. It's a line of actual control, it's undefined, right? The middle sector is reasonably well defined, but the eastern sector as well as the western sector, there is it's undefined.
Yeah.
And the Chinese have been telling their herdsmen, you go and settle there, and under the guise of the herdsmen going, and these guys protecting the herdsmen, they also come and they set up their facilities along with those villagers and build infrastructure and all that. And some of these incursions and forays seem to be happening from that. So I think from India's perspective, this latest clash just reaffirms what we believe of the Chinese, what the Indian establishment believes of the Chinese. And it means, you have to really significantly strengthen your infrastructure in the eastern sector. You have to have adequate military resources across the line of actual control, and you should stay on alert. And equally, if you look at what's happened since Galwan, India has tried to tell China that it can't be business as usual on other domains, while our forces are pretty much arrayed eyeball to eyeball in a staring contest. But the fact is, we are dependent on China for a lot of imports, right? And month after month, you keep looking at these numbers and you look at Chinese imports that continue to increase. And the reason for that is a lot of components and a lot of intermediates still come to India from China. And we have this article today in our paper on how the budget is also could likely look at incentives and disincentives to boost domestic manufacturing and to restrict imports as a way to sort of reduce India's dependency on Chinese imports. I think that is an equally important thing that we have to do. So what we need to do is not just on the military front, but also on the trade and business front.
And the economy front, absolutely. There are some who believe, and I will come back to some of the points that you mentioned, but there is a fourth scenario that some are painting, and that is the nomination of the next Dalai Lama approaching, and the significance of Tawang in that context. You think this also could have been an impetus?
Like I said, it could have been anything. We do know that this is an outstanding issue for the Chinese, but it is not the most outstanding issue for the Chinese, right? It would have been an outstanding issue for the Chinese if there had been any uncertainty about Tibet. There is zero uncertainty about Tibet right now.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Tibet is part of China, right? I know there is a freedom movement on, and right. I know there is a Free Tibet organization even in Delhi, but the Chinese now consider Tibet as part of this, and I do not think any country in the world has argued against that, right. including us. Right? So I don't think, sure, so if there had been any uncertainty about Tibet, they might have been...
that might have sort of prompted them to...
Yeah, but the way the Chinese see it, they're sitting pretty as far as Tibet goes.
All right. I just want to talk about, you talked about infrastructure building now. Infrastructure building, India has, completely accelerated infrastructure building from this side. There is a possibility, and that that these skirmishes or these violent face-offs which are coming to light more often, is it because we have now built up that infrastructure to sort of get more visibility on those? Could it be because of that, or do you think, and that is the way actually going forward?
Could be, but I also think they're just getting reported more. Right? I mean, it just become very difficult to not report these. So I just guess that they're getting reported more. I don't think this was, there are some reports that when I read make this sound like an invasion. It wasn't. It was an incursion. It was an effort to gain higher ground, the way we see it. And it was promptly repulsed. And I just think that these things are getting reported more often. Previously, perhaps they were not reported quite as often. There are people who've told me that it's pretty much business as usual in the eastern sector, which means the Chinese keep trying to do these things and
they keep getting pushed back because of it. There are some analysts, and including the opposition, who are saying that why has New Delhi not been able to deal with China in this, because this has been going on for the last almost 2.5 years.
But how do you deal with them? Do you declare war on them? I mean, how do you deal with them?
And there's also the fact that this is not something that, last 3 years, yes, post-Galwan.
I'm sorry, I tried to answer you in a very facile way. Let me give you a proper answer. There are 3 dimensions on which any response can happen in any scenario against any adversary. One is at the global multilateral level, where you create enough of noise and discomfort for that person. Has India done that? I would think so.
Yes.
Right. The second thing is on the infrastructure and military front, where you make sure you have adequate infrastructure and you have adequate military, and to make sure that the incursions are repulsed and there's no further adventurism and expansionism. Has India done that? Yes. The third thing, which is the trade and the business front, I don't think we've succeeded quite as well on that. But are we doing enough, or at least thinking of doing those things? I think we are. So I think the response is fairly calibrated and it is there. It is, of course, the duty of the opposition to press the government.
Right.
And I think it is also the duty of the government to be more transparent on many issues than it has been. But I think by and large, you would have to admit that India's response has been good. As long as you're not one of those people who believes that, we have ceded a lot of land to the Chinese over the last 3 years.
Because that is what the opposition has been tom-tomming, that we have. But the fact is that the government has also come back and said that, okay, no, it's not just now. It's been happening from the 60s, really.
I just think that this is a vexed border.
Yes.
It is completely undefined. It is establishing superiority along this border is critical to China's self-image as it embarks on this path of global greatness that it sees for itself, right? It's a narrative that has been horribly ruined by what's happening in China right now. But this is the path
He's trying to possibly bring it back.
But this is the path that China sees for itself. And at some point in time, India and China are going to settle this issue. Now, how they settle this issue is, I have no idea, but it is something that will have to be done.
That will have to be done. India's G20 presidency, do you see that as an opportunity to engage with Beijing? Do you think New Delhi is going to use it as an opportunity to engage with Xi Jinping, with Beijing, and try and get at least the issue of the last 3 years resolved? How do you think the G20 presidency is going to serve?
I think there are bigger problems in the G20 presidency has to deal with rather than a bilateral issue between two countries. And I think India's channels with China are fairly open. It is just that I think the Chinese seem to be unwilling to, they are quite happy to discuss other issues rather than the border. I think this is something that they will have to discuss at some point in time. So I don't think India will particularly use G20 to discuss this, to push China, because there are enough fora, and G20 has got its plate full. right? I mean, there are lots of other issues that India has to look at, and I think India's most important role in the G20 will have to be as the voice of the global South, right? I mean,
Which Mr. Modi
when
himself
it comes
said,
to growth, when it comes to digital inclusion, when it comes to the climate crisis, and those are far more pressing issues, and those are issues which need a forum like the G20, and I think that is what India will focus on.
All right. Thank you so much, Sukumar. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, viewers, for watching this broadcast. We will keep coming back to you with more. Stay tuned to Hindustan Times.